It was a long drive from the small town of Pine Ridge to the cabin I'd be stationed at for the next few days. I was 24, fresh out of the training program, and this was my first solo assignment as a park ranger. I'd heard the stories about the area, how isolated it was, how people had gone missing over the years. Some of it felt exaggerated, but the stories were enough to make me feel a little uneasy as I drove down the gravel road that snaked through the dense woods of the national forest. The sky was overcast, a dull gray that seemed to stretch endlessly above me, as if the weather itself was indifferent to what I was about to face. My truck bounced over the uneven path, and I gripped the wheel a little tighter. The cabin wasn't much, just a simple one-story building tucked away behind tall pines and thick underbrush. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the feeling of being completely alone in the vast wilderness was both exhilarating and unsettling. When I pulled up to the cabin, I parked behind the small ranger station, a weathered structure that seemed to be holding its own against the harsh conditions. The cabin looked older than I had imagined from the photos, with chipped paint and a sagging roof, but it was sturdy enough for what I needed. There was a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, and a few steps led up to the front door. I grabbed my gear from the truck and made my way inside. The cabin smelled of wood and earth, with a faint odor of dampness from the recent rains. It was exactly what I had expected, a simple, no-frills place. The kitchen was small but functional, with a stove, a refrigerator, and the basics I'd need to survive the few days I'd be here. The living room was sparsely furnished, just a couple of chairs, a small table, and a wood-burning stove. There was a small bedroom in the back with a single bed covered by an old quilt. Nothing luxurious, but it was comfortable. I unpacked my things and settled in, taking stock of the surroundings. There was a radio in the corner, an old one that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I fiddled with the dial, hoping to catch some news from the outside world, but the only thing I could get was static. That was fine. I didn't need much company, and I had my work to focus on. I checked my watch. It was just past noon. The rest of the day passed slowly. I went through the usual ranger duties, checking the perimeter of the cabin, looking over the logs from previous rangers, making sure there was no sign of recent illegal activity or wildlife encroaching too close. By evening, I had everything in order. The cabin was safe and I could relax for the night. But as the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky darkened, an odd feeling settled over me. There was something about the quiet, the isolation that didn't feel right. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves outside, but everything else was still. No animals, no birds calling. It felt like the entire forest had gone silent, as if holding its breath. I tried to push the unease away, telling myself it was just the solitude getting to me. I sat down at the small table and tried to focus on a book I had brought with me. The fire crackled in the stove, casting a warm glow across the room. But even the crackling couldn't mask the sensation that something was off. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 8 p.m. when I first heard the noise. A knock. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it came again, louder this time, more deliberate. 3 solid raps on the cabin door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The forest was far too remote for anyone to be out here, especially this late. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept toward the door. My breath was shallow, my senses alert. I stood still for a moment, listening, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no other sounds. I opened the door cautiously, shining the light across the porch. Nothing. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the dark yard. The trees swayed gently, but there was no sign of anyone. I felt ridiculous. Who the hell would be out here at this hour? Still, something didn't sit right with me. I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. The rest of the night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder than usual, and every gust of wind felt like it was carrying something unseen. I tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept racing, wondering if I had imagined the knock or if there was something more to it. By the time morning arrived, I was exhausted, but I went about my duties as usual. I checked the area around the cabin again, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary.
No footprints.
No signs of someone being here. The day passed quietly, though I couldn't escape the sense that I was being watched. At times, I'd glance up and catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. As night fell again, I decided to keep the lights off and stay as quiet as possible, hoping that whatever or whoever had been out there the previous night would leave me in peace. I didn't want to take any chances. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I had to stay alert, stay aware of my surroundings. Around 10 p.m., the knock came again. This time, it was even more insistent, pounding on the door like someone was desperate to get in. My heart raced, and I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the rifle I'd stored in the corner of the room, checking to make sure it was loaded before cautiously approaching the door. The knock came again, harder now. 3 raps, then silence. I swung the door open, rifle in hand, but once again, nothing. The porch was empty. No one was there. My breath came in shallow bursts, my fingers gripping the rifle tighter than I'd like to admit. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, the dark shadows of the trees, but there was no sign of movement. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, barely audible, coming from the woods. I turned quickly, my pulse quickening. A figure darted between the trees, just a shadow in the distance. I should have stayed inside. I should have locked the door and waited for daylight. But something inside me snapped, and before I could think better of it, I was out there, moving toward the noise. The woods were thick, the underbrush dense, and every step I took seemed to echo in the still night. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the figure kept just ahead of me, always just out of reach. It moved with unnatural speed, weaving between the trees, keeping itself hidden. I stopped when I realized that I had wandered far too deep into the woods. My nerves were shot. The cabin was miles behind me, and the only thing I had with me was my rifle. I turned around to head back, but when I did, I froze. There, standing between the trees, was the figure again, just a silhouette in the darkness. It was watching me. No sound, no movement, just 2 dark eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I raised the rifle, but before I could do anything, the figure turned and vanished into the forest, moving faster than I could follow. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. This was no random person. Whoever or whatever was out here was playing with me. I didn't know why, but I knew I couldn't stay out here much longer. I made my way back to the cabin as quickly as I could, breathing heavily, my heart pounding. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, staring out the window, waiting. But the night passed without incident. No more knocks, no more shadows in the woods. The next morning, I left. I didn't want to stay another night. I never found out who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. The woods around that cabin weren't as empty as they seemed, and I was never coming back. The rain had been pouring down for hours. It wasn't your typical downpour. It came in sharp, jagged bursts, followed by sudden silence. That kind of rain where everything feels wet and cold, even the air itself. I had rented this cabin out in the middle of nowhere, just to get away from it all. But as the night drew on, I started to wonder if this was such a good idea. I wasn't alone, though. My dog, Max, was here with me. A big, shaggy German Shepherd. He was always my companion in these isolated spots, where the world felt both too big and too small at the same time. We'd arrived earlier in the day, me, my backpack, and Max's leash. The cabin wasn't much, just a wooden structure tucked into the woods of Oregon. I wasn't expecting luxury. The owner had said it was an off-the-beaten-path kind of place. And that's exactly what it was. No other cabins around, no neighbors, no traffic. The kind of solitude you only get by driving miles down a narrow, winding dirt road until you think you've passed the edge of civilization. The first few hours had been nice. Max sniffed around, marking whatever tree caught his attention, and I unpacked my things, setting up a little campfire outside. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the fresh, earthy scent of the wet forest, and I felt like I was finally able to breathe again. The stress of work, city life, everything else, it all faded away. But as the evening wore on, the rain turned everything into a gloomy blur. The fire died down, and the cabin's old wooden walls creaked in the wind. That was when the unease began to settle in. The silence that followed the rain, broken only by the occasional howl of wind, made me hyper-aware of every little noise. Max had been acting weird for a while. At first, I chalked it up to the weather, but his behavior kept shifting. He wouldn't leave the cabin's doorway, staring out into the rain like he was waiting for something. His fur was damp, but his body was stiff, and he kept growling low under his breath, like he sensed something just out of reach. I tried to brush it off. I mean, we were in the woods. Could have been anything. A squirrel, another animal, maybe even a person, though I doubted it. There was no one around here for miles. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Max started barking suddenly, a sharp, frantic sound. It made my heart jump. I grabbed his collar, trying to tug him back inside, but he pulled hard, digging his claws into the floorboards. I could hear something outside, the sound of branches snapping in the distance. Slow, deliberate steps. I froze. My brain scrambled to make sense of what I was hearing. There wasn't anyone else around. Was there? Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a bear. But why would they be so close? Max wouldn't stop barking, and the growls turned deeper, more insistent. I pulled open the cabin door just a crack, enough to peer out into the rain. The yard was swallowed in shadows, but I could make out something moving along the tree line. A figure, tall and unnaturally still, stood at the edge of the woods. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't any kind of creature I had ever seen. The figure was human, but it didn't move like one. It just stood there, unmoving, as though it had been waiting for something. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I closed the door with a soft click, locking it behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the tension in my legs, like I was ready to run. But where? The rain outside continued its relentless rhythm, as if the world had become even more distant. Max was no help. He was still growling, now pacing back and forth, his eyes locked on the door. It wasn't just the figure outside that was unsettling. It was the complete stillness of everything else. There was no other movement. The woods were too quiet now. Even the birds had gone silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I tried to distract myself. I found a flashlight and checked the supplies I'd brought, just in case. The cabin was simple: bed, kitchen, a small bathroom, but there wasn't much in the way of comfort. Everything felt temporary. The old wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls felt thin, as if any sound outside would travel right through them. The hours dragged on. The rain didn't let up, and the figure outside stayed there, unmoving, a faint silhouette through the window. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What could I even say? I think someone's out there, but I don't know who. It wasn't exactly a solid reason for them to come out all the way here. Max was getting more agitated, and I had to force myself to stay calm. The quiet outside was still unsettling, but I had to focus. I couldn't let fear take control, not with Max relying on me. We were out here alone, in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea what I was dealing with. I decided to take a quick look around the cabin, just to make sure everything was secure. The windows were locked. The door was sturdy. I checked the back door as well, making sure it was bolted shut. Everything felt like it was in place, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Max, still restless, whined low in his throat. He wasn't calming down. I needed to figure out what was going on. The figure outside hadn't moved for hours. It was almost like it was waiting for me to make a move. I grabbed my jacket, pulled it on over my damp clothes, and slipped my boots on. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see what was out there, but I had no choice. It was either sit here and wait or make sure we were safe. The door opened slowly, and Max bolted outside without hesitation, barking furiously. I called after him, but he ignored me. I stepped out after him, the rain soaking through my jacket immediately. The flashlight flickered as I scanned the yard. Max was just ahead of me, standing near the tree line, staring at something I couldn't see. I took a deep breath and walked closer, my heart in my throat. The figure was gone, but the feeling didn't lift. It was as though the whole forest was holding its breath. Max growled again, a low, unsettling sound that sent a chill down my spine. I looked around. No one was there. The night was completely still, but I could still feel the presence. Something just out of sight, hiding in the shadows. I didn't want to wait to find out what it was. I turned back toward the cabin, and Max followed, his pace quickening as if he too wanted to get back inside. Once the door was closed, I locked it again, and this time, I felt the weight of it. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching us, was gone. I wasn't sure why, but I knew it was over. For now, I sat down on the couch, my head spinning. Max climbed up beside me, his head resting in my lap. I let out a long, shaky breath, looking out at the rain still falling, the world beyond the cabin as silent and watchful as ever. It was over, but it felt like something had changed, something I couldn't quite name. Max's soft breathing was the only sound as I sat there, my thoughts scattered. I'd come out here for peace, for quiet, but I knew now that the quiet wasn't always the peaceful kind. And sometimes you don't know who or what might be waiting just outside the door. But we were safe now, and that at least was something. I had always been drawn to the idea of a secluded cabin getaway, a place far from the noise of everyday life. So, when the chance came to take a week off and rent a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee, I jumped at it. My dog, Rex, a German Shepherd, was my only companion for the trip. I wasn't married and didn't have many friends who could take off for a week, so it was just us. Me, a quiet week in the woods, and Rex. The cabin was located miles away from the nearest town, nestled among towering trees that seemed to touch the sky. I had done a little research before coming out here, nothing too deep, just the basics. The cabin was built in the 1930s, and it had all the rustic charm you'd expect. A small wooden structure with a stone fireplace, a creaky porch, and a tin roof that would surely echo in the rain. It seemed peaceful, isolated, perfect. As soon as we arrived, I could tell Rex was excited. He hopped out of the truck, tail wagging, sniffing every inch of the surroundings. I opened the cabin door and stepped inside. It smelled old wood, dust, and a faint mustiness that was oddly comforting. The air inside was cool, and the sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows on the hardwood floors. I unpacked and set up for the evening. There wasn't much to do here, but that was the point. I was looking to disconnect. Just me, the dog, and nature. I figured I'd cook something simple for dinner and enjoy the evening. But before I could start, I noticed the strange silence.
No birds, no insects.
Just stillness. I hadn't thought much of it at first, But the more I sat there, the more I realized how unnatural it felt. It was almost as if the woods around me were holding their breath. The day passed without incident, and after dinner, I let Rex out for a walk. The cabin was surrounded by a thick forest, and the path we took was narrow and overgrown. Rex led the way, his nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to sniff at something, then continuing down the trail. I felt a little uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. I'd been to remote places before, never anything like this though. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the trees were closing in around me. We wandered for a while, Rex occasionally barking at the rustle of animals in the underbrush. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when we turned back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. A faint figure in the distance, standing just at the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but then I realized it was too tall and too still. A man standing motionless, watching me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart thumping in my chest. Rex, sensing my tension, growled softly beside me. The man didn't move. He didn't even seem to blink. He was just there, silent, unnervingly so. I could barely make out his features in the dimming light, but I could tell he wasn't wearing hiking clothes or anything suited for the outdoors. Instead, he was dressed in old, tattered clothing, something out of place for a man so deep in the woods. I called out, though it came out more as a hoarse whisper. "Hey, you okay?" No response, not a single movement. I considered turning back, but something about him, his stillness, was off. Rex, usually so bold, was now firmly standing beside me, his hackles raised, tail stiff. That didn't make me feel any better. In fact, the longer I stood there, the more my gut twisted with unease. I glanced around for any signs of other people. There was nothing, no vehicle parked anywhere, nothing at all. My mind raced. What was he doing here? The nearest neighbor was a good 2 miles away, and this was the middle of nowhere. As I stood frozen, I saw him shift, just the slightest movement, almost imperceptible. It was enough to snap me out of my trance. I tugged at Rex's leash and started walking quickly back toward the cabin. The man didn't follow, but his presence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. As I reached the cabin door, I glanced back one last time. He was still standing there, motionless, watching. That night, I locked all the doors and windows. I made sure the fireplace was roaring to ward off any chill, and I kept Rex close by, even though he never once let up on his low growl. The silence outside was almost deafening. Even the wind had died down. I spent the rest of the evening sitting in the armchair by the fire, my mind racing. Who was that man? Was he just lost? Had he been living out there for years? Or was there something more sinister going on? I didn't sleep much that night, only half watching the flickering shadows cast by the fire. Rex was restless, constantly shifting on the rug, occasionally lifting his head to listen to the night outside. At one point, I thought I heard a faint knock at the door, but when I checked, there was nothing. Just the cold, empty porch and the darkened woods. The next day, I decided to go for a hike, trying to shake off the sense of dread that lingered over me. Rex stayed close, his every step mirroring mine, as if he too was on edge. I ventured down the same path I'd walked the day before, hoping to get a better sense of the area and to clear my head. But as we walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. The trees seemed to lean in closer with every step, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive. Rex kept looking over his shoulder, his ears perked up. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon something that made my stomach twist. A small clearing, overgrown with weeds, with a large stack of logs in the center. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. Near the logs was a pile of old, decaying belongings, clothes, shoes, even a rusted can of beans. It was like someone had just left them behind, but there was no sign of the person, no sign of anything that could explain it. I turned to leave, feeling more nervous than ever, but before I could, I heard a branch snap behind me. Rex immediately went into alert mode, barking loudly, and I whipped around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing, just the wind rustling the leaves. But something didn't feel right. My breath was shallow, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. We made our way back to the cabin quickly, and I spent the rest of the day inside, watching through the windows. The man hadn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I decided to pack up and leave. I didn't care how much I'd paid for the cabin. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going on. I gathered my things and loaded the truck, Rex sitting anxiously by the door. As I was about to drive off, I saw something in the distance, the figure of a man standing at the edge of the woods. But this time, I wasn't going to wait. I slammed the truck into drive and sped off, not looking back. I never learned who that man was or why he was out there, and I didn't care to find out. All I knew was that some places, some situations are better left unexplored. The sun had just set, casting a deep orange hue across the sky as I drove along the winding dirt road, the tires of my car kicking up dust behind me. I hadn't been back to this cabin in years. Not since the divorce. Not since everything had fallen apart. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, tucked far enough away from the nearest town that you could feel the isolation in the air. It had been his place, Frank's, my ex-husband. He had always loved it here, even before we bought it together. I didn't care for it much, but it was one of those things that seemed important to him back then, and I wanted to make him happy. The more I think about it now, the more I realize how little it actually meant to me. I hadn't been here since we split. He had taken the house in town, and I took the cabin, though I didn't want it. It was his after all. But here I was, 5 years later, heading back. I don't know why I agreed to come back for the weekend. Maybe I thought I could finally let go of the anger. Maybe it was the final chance to face the memories. Couldn't be sure. But here I was, approaching the cabin with a knot in my stomach. The gravel driveway was overgrown, the weeds growing through the cracks in the stone. The cabin itself looked almost the same as it always had. A 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch and a slanted roof. The paint on the trim was peeling, and the windows were dusty, but other than that, it was still standing strong. It was quiet, unnaturally quiet, as if the place had been abandoned for much longer than I had imagined. I parked the car next to the cabin, the engine sputtering to a stop. The silence felt suffocating, the kind of silence you only get in the woods, where there's no hum of traffic, no chatter of neighbors, just the wind and the rustling of leaves. I grabbed the duffel bag from the passenger seat, walking toward the front door. The wooden steps creaked beneath my feet, but I ignored it, pushing the door open. The smell of dust and stale air hit me immediately, and I winced. It had been too long. The interior was just as I remembered it, except now there was a certain eeriness to the place. The worn-out leather furniture was still there, the wooden floors slightly scratched from years of use. I moved through the rooms slowly, letting my fingers brush against the surfaces, as if I could somehow erase the years of pain. There were photos on the walls, photos of us when we were happy. Smiling faces, captured moments of a life that seemed so far removed from the person I was now. The house seemed almost alive, as if it were holding onto the remnants of the past, clinging to memories of a time when everything had seemed right. I went into the kitchen, hoping to find something familiar that might make me feel better. There was an old coffee maker sitting on the counter, covered in a fine layer of dust. I wiped it off and plugged it in, eager for some sort of comfort, even if it was just a cup of coffee. As the machine brewed, I walked over to the window and looked outside. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick and impenetrable. There were no paths, no trails, just dense trees and underbrush. It seemed almost as though the wilderness was reclaiming the land, slowly, deliberately. My eyes scanned the forest, but I didn't see anything unusual, just shadows in the trees. I turned away from the window, focusing on the coffee that was now dripping into the pot. The sound of the water bubbling echoed in the silence, reminding me of how alone I was out here. It felt like the cabin itself was watching me, waiting for me to remember something important, but I couldn't place what it was. The coffee was ready, so I poured myself a cup and sat down at the kitchen table. It was hard to believe that once upon a time, Frank and I had sat here together, talking about our plans, our future. We used to spend weekends here, just the two of us, away from the world. But that was before everything fell apart. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, but eventually, I stood up and went to the back door. The evening had descended into a deep gray, and I could barely make out the silhouettes of the trees in the fading light. I stepped out onto the back porch and took a deep breath of the cool, crisp air. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound came from the woods, too loud to be a small animal, too deliberate to be a breeze. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a deer or some other woodland creature. But something about the sound made me uneasy. It wasn't natural. I stood there for a few moments, listening. The sound stopped, and the air grew still again. My breath fogged in front of me, and for a brief second, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I turned back inside, locking the door behind me. I had always felt a little uneasy in this cabin, even when we lived here. Now, alone in it, the feeling was overwhelming. The thought that someone might be out there watching made my skin crawl. I decided to try and ignore the anxiety creeping up on me and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I didn't need to go outside, but something inside me insisted on checking the perimeter. I stepped back out onto the porch, shining the beam of light over the yard. Everything was still. But then, just as I was about to head back inside, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, too tall to be a normal person, and the shadows seemed to cling to it like a second skin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape against the trees. I should have gone back inside, locked the door, and called someone. But instead, I found myself stepping forward, the beam of the flashlight moving shakily in front of me. And then, just as quickly as I had seen it, the figure was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the woods. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned back to the cabin, every muscle in my body urging me to run, to lock myself in and never look back. But I didn't. I spent the rest of the night pacing the cabin, peeking through the windows, waiting for something, anything, that would make sense of what I had seen. But nothing ever came. By morning, the forest was as calm and still as it had always been. The figure, if it had even been real, was nowhere to be found. I packed my things quickly, my nerves frayed, and my thoughts scattered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here, that something was watching me, waiting for me to leave. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing there, just beyond the tree line, still watching. But there was nothing, only the empty road ahead of me. I never went back to that cabin. It was as if the place had been a part of my past that I wasn't meant to revisit. And after that night, I knew I couldn't. The memories of Frank, of us, would stay with me forever. But the cabin? It would remain abandoned, just like everything else from that chapter of my life. had been working nonstop for weeks, trying to get through a heavy project at work. By the time I finally had some time off, I was drained, physically and mentally. I needed to get away, to clear my head, and I decided a weekend in the woods would do the trick. A little cabin tucked away in the middle of nowhere sounded like the perfect retreat. A place where I could be alone, with no distractions, no noise, just the hum of nature and the quiet of solitude. I'd found the cabin online, in a little town up in the hills. The listing described it as a cozy, rustic getaway nestled in the forest, just beyond a small, forgotten graveyard. The cabin was owned by a man named Frank, who didn't seem to have much of a social media presence. All he'd mentioned was the price, the directions, and a vague warning about the local wildlife. That was fine with me. The less I had to interact with anyone, the better. When I arrived on Friday afternoon, the cabin was exactly as described. It was small but sturdy, built of weathered wood with a simple stone chimney. The graveyard wasn't visible from the cabin, but I could tell it was nearby. The air smelled of damp earth, and I could hear the rustling of the wind through the trees. The graveyard itself seemed to be an old one, with weathered tombstones scattered haphazardly in the woods behind the cabin. The graves were mostly overgrown with weeds, some so old that the names were completely illegible. The cabin had a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, a fire pit off to the side, and a few pine trees surrounding it that gave it a secluded, isolated feel. Inside, there was a large stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a table, and a couple of worn couches. I was on my own for the weekend, and that's how I liked it. I quickly unloaded my things, threw some logs into the fireplace, and made myself a drink. It was quiet, too quiet at first, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, but I brushed it off as a natural product of being far away from civilization. As the night wore on, I got comfortable. I sat by the fire with a book, letting the warmth from the flames fill the room. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, but occasionally, I'd hear something from outside. The wind, the rustle of branches, the scurrying of small animals. And then there were other noises, faint, distant, footsteps. At first, I thought it might just be a deer or some other forest animal. But as the night deepened, the sounds got closer. Closer than any animal should have been. The feeling I got in my gut told me something was off, but I shrugged it off as paranoia. I had read stories about people hearing things in the woods. It was easy to make yourself believe things were happening when you were alone. I closed the curtains, making sure to lock the door before heading to bed. But the air inside the cabin felt heavier now. The walls creaked and groaned as if the house itself was unsettled. The next morning, I woke up to a gray sky. It had rained during the night, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, so I decided to take a walk. I grabbed a jacket and stepped outside, heading toward the old graveyard that was supposed to be nearby. The ground was muddy, and the wetness of the trees made everything look darker, even though it was still early. The path to the graveyard was overgrown with brambles, but I managed to make my way through. The graveyard was eerie. The stones were cracked and leaning in every direction, and the moss on some of the graves made it seem like the place had been abandoned for centuries. It wasn't the kind of graveyard you'd see in a town. It was raw, untended, like nature had started reclaiming it. There were no fences or gates, just a small clearing with scattered tombstones. I walked among the graves, trying not to think about the eerie silence. The names on the stones were hard to read, but I noticed a few dates that were well over a century old. It was peaceful in a strange way, but there was an underlying sense of decay, like the place was forgotten. I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the wind moving through the trees or the occasional rustle of an animal. There was something else in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to leave, but as I turned to walk back to the cabin, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. These ones weren't distant. They were close, too close, as if someone was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the graves and the fog rolling in. My heart was pounding now. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the rational part of my brain wasn't buying it. I hurried back to the cabin and locked the door, but the strange feeling lingered. The whole day felt off. I couldn't relax, and every time I heard a noise from outside, I froze. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I felt like I was being watched. Later that afternoon, I decided to go into town. Maybe I was just getting too worked up about being alone. I grabbed my keys and headed out, driving through the winding roads that led into the small village. It wasn't much, just a couple of houses, a small market, and a pub that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. I spent some time walking around, grabbing a cup of coffee, and talking to a few of the locals. No one seemed to think anything was out of the ordinary, but there was a palpable tension in the air, like the people were holding their breath, waiting for something. I didn't stay long and returned to the cabin as the sun began to set. That evening, I decided to keep the lights on inside and stay near the fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I told myself I was just tired. I had been working too much, and the isolation was starting to mess with my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made my heart race. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. This time, I wasn't imagining it. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth around the cabin. I could hear the crunch of the gravel underfoot, the rustle of leaves. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking. I checked the door again, double-checking the locks. It was then that I saw it, a shadow moving outside the window. I froze. My mind was racing. Who was out there? Someone who knew I was here? Someone who was stalking me? I didn't know what to do. I had no phone signal, and I wasn't sure how far the nearest neighbor was. I stayed in that cabin all night, the footsteps never stopping. Every time I thought I heard them moving away, they would return. When the sun finally rose, I couldn't wait to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could and headed out, never looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, standing in the middle of the woods, but the graveyard behind it seemed darker, somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. To this day, I can't explain what happened that weekend. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was something more. Either way, I've never gone back to that cabin. I can still hear the footsteps sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, and I wonder who or what was out there, waiting. It was mid-October when I decided to head out for a solo hunting trip to a small cabin I had rented up in the northern woods of Idaho. The air was cool, crisp, and the leaves had already started turning shades of gold and amber. I had taken a few trips to this area in the past with friends, but this time I was alone, and that in itself felt like a challenge. My friends had warned me not to go alone, especially with the weather turning, but I figured I'd be fine. It wasn't my first time out in the woods, and I had enough experience to take care of myself. The cabin sat on the edge of a vast expanse of forest, tucked away in a secluded area that could only be accessed via a narrow dirt road. The place wasn't fancy by any means, but it was perfect for what I needed. A small wooden structure with a tin roof, a single room with a fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a bed that had probably seen better days. It was perfect. I grabbed my hunting gear, locked my truck, and made my way inside, taking a deep breath of the fresh, pine-scented air. The first day was spent unpacking and setting up. I checked my rifle and bow, both of which I had brought for the trip, and made sure everything was in working order. The weather had turned colder than expected by the time nightfall came, so I started a fire in the fireplace, enjoying the crackle of the logs. The cabin felt warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the chill outside. I hadn't seen anyone else in the area all day, and the silence was almost eerie, but it didn't bother me. I was used to the quiet of the wilderness. That first night, I slept soundly, despite the occasional creaks of the cabin settling in the cold. I woke up early the next morning, long before dawn, and made my way out to the woods with my rifle. The woods were eerily silent, with not even a breeze to disturb the stillness. I walked for hours, pushing deeper into the forest, but I hadn't seen a single animal. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes hunting could be slow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By midday, I had come across a trail, and I followed it, hopeful that it would lead me to something. But as the day dragged on, I started feeling uneasy. I couldn't explain it. The trees around me felt too dense, the air too heavy. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels darting through the branches. It was just dead quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves. Still, I pressed on, determined to find something. As the sun began to set, I realized I had wandered far from the cabin. The trail had faded into thick underbrush, and I couldn't find my way back. I tried to remember the path I had taken, but everything around me started looking the same. I reached for my map, but it had slipped from my pocket when I was last checking my bearings. I cursed under my breath and stopped, trying to listen for anything familiar, any sounds that would guide me back. But all I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees, faint and distant. The woods were starting to close in on me. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down, and I realized that I was beginning to panic. My heart was beating faster, and I had a growing sense of urgency. I had to find my way back to the cabin. Fast. I started walking in what I thought was the direction of the cabin, but after what felt like hours, I wasn't sure anymore. The forest was swallowing me whole, and the daylight was fading quickly. The deepening shadows made everything seem unfamiliar, even the trees I had passed earlier. I tried to steady my breathing, but the more I moved, the more desperate I became. The crunch of my boots on the leaves was the only sound, and it was starting to feel too loud in the quiet of the woods. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal. I couldn't even see the sun through the thick canopy above, and the forest was a dark, suffocating place. I needed to calm down, but the panic was settling in like a weight on my chest. Then I heard it, a noise that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was soft at first, a rustling sound that didn't quite belong. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too methodical. My blood ran cold. Came again, this time closer. It sounded like footsteps. I stood completely still, holding my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps weren't from an animal, and they were definitely too heavy to be a bird or squirrel. Someone or something was out there. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The forest had always felt like a safe place to me, but now it felt suffocating, menacing. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to track the sound. It was faint, but it was definitely there. I stopped again, listening. The footsteps had stopped too. I waited and waited. Then, suddenly, the sound came again, but it wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was the sound of someone scraping against the bark of a tree. It was too calculated, too deliberate. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who else could be out here? I had seen no other vehicles, no signs of anyone else when I arrived. I took a deep breath and started walking again, moving faster now, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to close in around me as I pushed through the thick brush, every snap of a twig sending my heart into overdrive. I knew I had to keep moving, but I also knew I couldn't outrun whatever was following me. My mind was starting to race, and I realized I was no longer paying attention to where I was going. I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction anymore. The only thing I could think of was getting back to the cabin. I couldn't even explain why, but it felt like if I didn't get back there soon, something worse was going to happen. Then, just as I thought I saw a break in the trees, I stumbled across something. The ground beneath me gave way slightly, and I looked down. There, lying just off the trail, was a set of footprints in the mud. They were fresh, and they were heading in the same direction I was. My heart stopped, and the weight of dread slammed into me. I wasn't alone. There was someone or something out here with me. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I pushed through the panic and ran. I didn't look back. The cabin had to be close. I knew it had to be. The woods were no longer the peaceful sanctuary I had entered. They were a labyrinth, and I was being stalked by someone whose intentions I didn't know. The final stretch of forest seemed to go on forever. But just as the darkness started to overtake me, I saw it, the faint outline of the cabin through the trees. I burst through the underbrush and ran for the door. I slammed it shut behind me and locked the deadbolt. I didn't move from the cabin that night. I sat by the fire, eyes flicking to the windows every few seconds, listening to the sounds outside. The rustling of leaves was all I heard, and eventually, the night grew quieter. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, never left me. The next morning, I left. I didn't even pack up my gear. I left everything behind and drove out of the woods, the forest stretching out behind me, still silent, still dark, and full of secrets I'd never fully understand. I had been planning this trip for months. A break from the stress of city life, a chance to disconnect, clear my mind, and be alone with my thoughts. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin deep in the English countryside. I had rented a small, old wooden cabin, far from the nearest village, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. It was my escape from everything. The noise, the pressure, the constant buzz of technology. I wanted peace and quiet, a chance to unwind. The cabin itself wasn't anything fancy. It had that worn, rustic charm to it, like it had been around for generations. The wood smelled like damp pine, and the floor creaked underfoot. There was a small fireplace in the living room, and a single bed tucked into one corner. I loved it. Simple, unpretentious, just what I needed. I had the whole weekend planned. A hike through the forest, a bit of reading, and plenty of time to just relax. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. The air was fresh, cool, and smelled of moss and earth. There was no one around. No cars, no houses, just trees stretching for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor, according to the owner, was about a mile away. Hardly anyone would notice if I disappeared into the woods. I set down my things inside, made a cup of tea, and took in the stillness. For the first time in weeks, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. But as night fell, things began to feel off. First, it was just little things. The wind outside seemed to pick up, shaking the windows and making the cabin groan. Then there was the sound, almost like footsteps, but soft, like someone was walking just outside. I figured it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. Still, it was enough to make me uneasy. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I had dinner, some canned soup and bread, and spent the evening by the fire, reading a book. The shadows in the room grew longer as the night wore on, and the fire crackled. But even though I was tired, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if something or someone was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a face in the window, but there was nothing. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I closed the curtains, locked the door, and slipped into bed. The night was quiet again, save for the wind that howled through the trees. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It was probably just the isolation playing tricks on me, I thought. I woke up later, but it wasn't to the usual quiet of the countryside. There was a sound, soft but distinct. A faint tapping like fingernails against wood came from the other side of the cabin, near the front door. My heart skipped a beat. I lay still, listening, waiting. The tapping continued, irregular but persistent. I could hear the occasional scrape, like someone was dragging something across the wooden floor. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. Slowly, I got out of bed, as quietly as possible. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and walked toward the front door. The wind had stopped, and everything outside was eerily still. I peered through the small gap in the curtains, scanning the darkness, but I saw nothing. No sign of movement, no figure lurking in the shadows. Just the empty, black void of the countryside. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I just stood there, heart pounding, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself again. Maybe a branch had tapped against the door or a piece of wood had shifted. Still, there was no denying the creeping sense of dread that was crawling under my skin. I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, something wasn't right. I checked the door. It was locked, just as it had been when I went to bed. No sign of anything unusual. I didn't know what to make of it, but the sense of unease stayed with me. Eventually, I managed to convince myself to go back to bed. I turned off the flashlight and tried to settle down, though sleep didn't come easily. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. This time, it was much closer, right outside my bedroom window. The soft tap, 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 followed by that strange dragging sound. I froze, not daring to move. My breath caught in my throat as I listened intently. It was a woman's voice, not a loud one, but a voice nonetheless, soft and trembling, as though she were whispering to herself. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was enough to send chills down my spine. It sounded like a plea or maybe a warning. Couldn't tell. I had to know what it was. I couldn't just lie there in the dark, waiting for whatever this was to reveal itself. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a lost traveler or someone from the neighboring cabin. But why the strange noises? Why the whispers? I grabbed my flashlight again and crept toward the window. I didn't dare open it, but I peered through the curtain. My eyes strained in the darkness, trying to make sense of the shapes outside. The flashlight beam flicked over the trees, the yard, and then there, by the edge of the woods, a figure. A woman. She was standing in the darkness, her back turned to me. She was tall, thin, wearing a long, dark coat that seemed to swallow her whole. Her hair was long and unkempt, wild, like it hadn't been brushed in days. She didn't move, just stood there, staring into the forest. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could feel the weight of her presence. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed. I didn't want to approach her, but I also couldn't bring myself to look away. There was something so wrong about the whole scene. Her stillness, the eerie silence around her. Then suddenly she moved. Not quickly, but slowly, deliberately. She took a step toward the cabin. And then another, and another. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. I was shaking now, unsure of what I was witnessing. I told myself I had to get out of there, that I couldn't stay another minute in this place. I grabbed my things, ready to leave, but when I checked the front door, it was still locked. I turned to the back, but there was no way out. I was trapped. I stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to move, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. The tapping never came again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting. By morning, the sun had come up, and the world outside was bathed in light again. The woman, if she had ever been there at all, was gone. The cabin was still empty, as it had been when I first arrived. I didn't stick around to find out what had happened. I packed up quickly, ignoring the strange noises still echoing in the silence. When I left, I didn't look back. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. The air felt thick as I stepped out of the truck, the engine still idling behind me. I glanced back at the faded wooden cabin ahead, its worn facade almost hidden by the encroaching trees of the northern Michigan forest. It was a long drive to get here, something I'd been meaning to do for years, but life always seemed to get in the way. Now, in my late 20s, I finally had the chance to escape the city and spend a few quiet days alone in the woods. The place was far from modern, with its peeling paint and creaky porch, but there was something oddly comforting about it. My name's Matt, by the way. I'm 28, work in software, and don't usually make time for things like this. I used to be into camping, hiking, all that outdoor stuff, but I hadn't done much of it in the past few years. This trip was supposed to be a reset, time to unwind, get away from emails and notifications, maybe even do some fishing. No big plans, just solitude. The first thing I did was unload my gear, the sound of the duffel bag zipping open breaking the silence of the woods. The forest around the cabin was dense, with trees that loomed high, casting dark, long shadows that stretched across the yard. It was mid-afternoon when I arrived, but the trees made it feel like evening already. I didn't mind it. Darkness in the woods was comforting. The cabin had no electricity, just a couple of propane lamps hanging by the door, and that was more than enough for me. I locked the truck, grabbed my cooler, and headed inside. The cabin was small, maybe about 800 square feet, with a single room that served as both living and sleeping space. There was an old wood stove in the center, a sagging sofa against the far wall, and a single window facing the tree line. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air. Setting my stuff down, I went straight to the stove and lit a fire, not because I needed warmth, it was warm enough, but because the crackling sound of fire soothed me. I threw a couple logs in, watched them catch, then sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of the day finally lift off my shoulders. It was peaceful, but then again, that was the point. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. Birds calling, the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional creak of the cabin. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe again. The afternoon passed slowly. I fiddled around with the fishing gear I brought, setting it up on the porch. The idea was to catch something for dinner, but I didn't feel like rushing. I just wanted to take my time, let the world spin without me for a bit. By the time evening rolled in, the sun had disappeared behind the tree line, and the shadows seemed to creep closer. It wasn't until I was sitting on the porch, staring out at the lake in the distance, that I realized how quiet it had become. Too quiet.
No birds.
No animals rustling. The silence was almost unnatural, like the woods were holding its breath. That's when I noticed the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line. I didn't move at first. I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps an animal standing in the shadow of a tree. But no, it was a person. Tall, thin, and wearing a worn-out coat, the kind you see in old photos of people working the land. He stood still, facing away from me, the fading light making it hard to make out any details. For a few moments, I thought about calling out, but something held me back. It wasn't that I was scared, not exactly. It was more like a gut feeling telling me not to make a sound. I waited. Time seemed to slow. The man didn't move, didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence. It was like he was part of the forest itself. After what felt like forever, I decided to grab my flashlight and get a better look. I didn't know why I felt the need to approach him, but I did. I stood up, heart thumping in my chest, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing. The man didn't seem to react as I got closer, but as the beam of light hit him, I froze. The angle was wrong. The light didn't show a face. Instead, it illuminated nothing but an empty space where his face should have been. Just a patch of black, as if the light itself couldn't penetrate it. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, eyes glued to the figure, trying to make sense of it. The shadows were playing tricks on me, I told myself. Maybe the fading light was distorting everything. But then, as if on cue, the figure turned. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't that. His face was an empty void, a deep blackness where eyes and features should have been. The rest of his body seemed normal enough, but his face was completely absent, like someone had just erased it. I stood there, frozen, as he started moving toward me. He didn't walk in a way that felt natural. His steps were slow, deliberate, like he was trying to make no sound at all. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned and ran inside the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, leaning back against the wooden frame, my pulse racing. The silence that followed was worse than anything I had felt outside. Felt thick, suffocating. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that I had just seen a shadow or something, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. Something about the way the man moved, or rather didn't move, had felt wrong. The hours dragged on. I barely slept that night, staying by the fire, listening to every crack of wood and every gust of wind outside. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted, but there was no sign of the man. Nothing at all. I spent the rest of the day inside, locked up tight, even though I knew it was probably irrational. The thought of going back outside made me uneasy, like the woods themselves were hiding something. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw was still out there, watching. The next morning, I packed up early. I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't know what I had seen, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I left and never came back. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw that night. All I know is that there are things in the woods you can't understand, and sometimes it's better not to try. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. The plan was simple. Get away to a secluded cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. I needed time to clear my head and escape the noise of city life. It was just me, a backpack, and a sleeping bag with a few simple supplies. The cabin I had rented was small but cozy, situated in a dense forest up north, just outside a tiny town in Wyoming. It wasn't a place most people knew about, and that's exactly why I picked it. I arrived late on Friday, the sun dipping low behind the horizon as I drove up a winding, gravel road that led deeper into the woods. The place wasn't even on Google Maps, just an old listing I found on a local rental site. I didn't think much of it. After all, the isolation was exactly what I wanted. I parked in front of the cabin, the sound of my engine cutting out, replaced by the gentle rustling of trees and the soft chirp of insects in the air. The cabin was small, wooden, and worn, with a heavy door that creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it was mostly bare. An old stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with a mattress that looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. I unpacked, set up my gear, and made myself comfortable. Felt peaceful, almost too quiet. I spent a few hours reading and then fell asleep, lulled by the sounds of the forest. I woke up early the next morning, before the sun even rose. The world outside was still, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I decided to go for a hike, eager to explore the woods around the cabin. The air was crisp, the ground damp from an earlier rainfall, and everything felt alive. Every leaf, every branch, every stone had a story to tell. As I hiked deeper into the woods, I started to notice something odd. The silence wasn't normal. It wasn't the usual quiet of nature. The absence of birds and insects was unsettling. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I saw something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There, at the far edge of the clearing, was a figure standing just out of sight. It was tall, unnaturally so, its posture bent at a strange angle. For a second, I thought it might be a tree, or maybe some wild animal, but as I stared longer, I saw the shape move. A cold chill ran through me. My heart raced, and I turned around quickly, not looking back. I hurried back toward the cabin, each step feeling like it was heavier than the last. When I got back, I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to my imagination. It had been a long hike, and I was probably just seeing things. Later that day, I decided to venture outside again. I wasn't going to let whatever I saw stop me from enjoying my trip. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood and wandering around the cabin. The unease from earlier didn't quite leave me, but I pushed it aside. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere in the woods changed. The light faded, and the shadows grew longer. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of something walking outside the cabin. It was a soft, deliberate step, like someone trying to be quiet. My heart jumped. I froze in place, listening closely. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then came a rustling sound, as if something was moving along the edge of the cabin. I slowly approached the window, peering through the cracked glass. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I saw nothing, just the sway of branches and the shifting shadows. I thought about grabbing my phone, maybe calling someone, but there was no signal out here. It was just me, and the isolation made everything feel worse. I decided to step outside, wanting to confront whatever it was. I grabbed a flashlight and walked cautiously toward the woods. I wasn't sure why I was so determined to check it out, but something inside told me it was better to face whatever was out there. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but everything remained still. There was no sign of movement, no creature, no person. I let out a breath, feeling foolish for getting so worked up over nothing. But just as I turned to go back inside, I heard a low, guttural sound, like something growling. It wasn't a bear or any animal I recognized. It was something deeper, more primal. The hairs on my neck stood up, and my instincts screamed at me to run. I didn't, though. I stayed still, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The growl grew louder, closer, but still I saw nothing. Then a figure emerged from the woods. It wasn't human. The way it moved, the way it hunched its shoulders, it wasn't right. Its limbs were twisted, bent at unnatural angles. Its face, no, its features were barely discernible in the dim light. It looked like a man, but distorted, like the body was trying to be something it wasn't. I could make out its eyes, wide, white, and almost glowing in the dark. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The thing didn't make any noise as it approached, but I could hear its heavy breathing, the sound of its feet dragging against the ground. I took a step back, then another, my body trembling with fear. Whatever it was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't normal. I bolted for the cabin, slamming the door behind me, locking it tight. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a broken piece of wood, and held it in my hands like a weapon. I backed away from the door, watching it closely. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. The thing outside wasn't just watching. It was waiting. Minutes passed, maybe more. I couldn't tell anymore. The tension was unbearable, and every creak of the wood or snap of a twig felt like it was the thing getting closer. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. I spun around, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I could have sworn I saw something press against the window. A face, barely visible in the glass. The figure was close, too close. I grabbed my things, checked the cabin door again, and made my way toward the back. My mind was racing, but all I could think about was getting out. The figure hadn't tried to break in, but I had no idea what it wanted, or why it was following me. Maybe it wasn't following me. Maybe it had been here all along, just waiting for me to show up. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my backpack, shoved it into the car, and sped off, not looking back. The last thing I saw was a faint silhouette moving just beyond the tree line, watching as I drove away. I haven't gone back to that place, and I don't plan on it. I don't know what it was that I saw that night, but I know this. It wasn't human. It was something else, something far older, something that should have never been there. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Some things are better left undisturbed. The cabin was tucked away on a small farm, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It had been empty for years, but the owner, an old man who'd passed away a few months earlier, had kept it in decent shape. His daughter, a woman in her late 40s named Sarah, had contacted me to help with some cleaning and repairs before she decided what to do with the place. I had been looking for a break from the usual grind of city life, so I agreed to spend a few days there, cleaning up and fixing whatever needed attention. I wasn't expecting much. A few broken windows, some dirt, maybe a cracked floorboard or two. What I didn't expect was how unsettling the place would feel once I was inside. It was a quiet, crisp morning when I arrived. The weather was colder than I'd anticipated. A chill in the air that made my breath visible as I stepped out of my truck and grabbed my gear. The cabin looked simple enough. A small, wooden structure with a rusted tin roof and a porch that sagged slightly to the right. The front door was ajar, and I could hear the wind howling through the cracks in the wood. I didn't think much of it at first. It was an old place, and the wind had a way of pushing doors open. Inside, the cabin was darker than I expected. Dust covered almost everything, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. The furniture, mostly old chairs and a small dining table, was covered in white sheets, giving the whole room an eerie, abandoned look. The fireplace had a pile of charred logs in it, but the chimney had clearly not been used in years. I started by sweeping up the dust and clearing out the dead leaves and cobwebs in the corners. As I worked, I noticed something strange. The kitchen cabinets were stocked with canned goods and dried beans, even though no one had lived here for months. They weren't exactly fresh, but they were still sealed, which was odd given that Sarah had mentioned no one had been out here since her father died. I put it out of my mind and focused on the task at hand, taking a quick look through the old windows. The farm was vast, the land stretching for miles in every direction. There were no other houses nearby, just fields of dry, brown grass and a few old, weathered barns. The isolation felt comforting in a way, but also a bit oppressive. The first night in the cabin was quiet, too quiet. I'd settled into the small bedroom, trying to ignore the creaky bed and the strange, almost suffocating atmosphere in the house. The wind howled through the cracks, and every now and then, the cabin would groan, as if it were shifting on its old foundations. I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was colder than before, and I could hear faint noises coming from downstairs. Scraping sounds, like something moving across the floor. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a mouse or some other animal in the walls. But the noises were too deliberate, too purposeful. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking things. But the sounds continued, slow and steady. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way down the stairs. The beams creaked under my feet, and I had to tread carefully, not wanting to wake up whatever or whoever was causing those sounds. The living room was still empty, but I could see something faintly moving near the kitchen. The dim light from the flashlight revealed a shadow, something large and dark, blocking the entrance to the kitchen. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog that had wandered in. But then I saw it move again, and it wasn't an animal. It was too large, too human-shaped. I was breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was standing still, as if it were waiting for me to notice it. Then, as if it had sensed my presence, it slowly turned towards me. The light from the flashlight illuminated its face, and I saw that it was a woman. Her features were strange, too sharp, too gaunt, and she was staring at me with eyes that looked far too wide for a normal person. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. She didn't move, just stood there in the dim light, her dark eyes locked onto mine. The silence was deafening, and my mind raced to find an explanation. But there was none. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, not even caring if I made noise anymore. I didn't stop until I was in the bedroom. The door slammed shut behind me. I threw the lock into place, even though I knew it wouldn't keep anyone out. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, expecting her to appear again. But there was no more movement, no more sounds. It was as if the night had returned to its usual eerie stillness. The next morning, I decided to leave. I had planned on staying for a few more days, but after what happened last night, I wasn't willing to stick around to find out who or what that woman was. I packed up my things quickly, trying to shake off the lingering dread that settled deep in my chest. Just as I was about to leave, I took one last look around the cabin. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. The kitchen cabinets, which had been closed the night before, were wide open, and the cans of food that had been neatly arranged on the shelves were now scattered across the floor. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the cabin in the distance, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I never went back to that farm. I don't know what happened there, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. That woman was real, and she wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something about that place, about her, felt wrong, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. The whole experience left me unsettled for a long time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows again. I had never been one for the outdoors, not really. The whole idea of camping or hiking always seemed like a hassle. Too much walking, too little comfort. But when my friend Luke invited me on a weekend getaway to a cabin he found online, I didn't think twice. I figured it'd be a chance to escape the routine, even if I wasn't particularly excited about the setting. After all, it was just a cabin in the woods, and how bad could it really be? We drove out to a remote area outside of Asheville, North Carolina, far enough from town that the only things around were trees, mountains, and the occasional rustling of some animal moving through the underbrush. The cabin itself sat on a piece of land that had been abandoned for years. According to Luke, it had been listed as a rustic getaway, though from the photos I'd seen, I had my doubts. The place was even more run down than I expected. It was small, built from dark wood that looked like it had absorbed more rain than it could handle. The roof had patches where shingles were missing, and the porch creaked under our weight. Still, I didn't think much of it. We unloaded our bags, started a fire in the pit outside, and made ourselves comfortable. Night fell quickly in the woods. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the temperature dropped. We stayed outside for a while, drinking beer and talking about nothing. As the evening wore on, a feeling crept over me, something subtle, like the air had thickened. I glanced around the perimeter of the cabin, where shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. It felt like we were being watched, though I told myself it was just the usual paranoia that comes with being far from civilization. Eventually, Luke suggested we head inside. The cold was seeping into my bones, and the wind was starting to pick up. The cabin was dimly lit, the only light coming from a couple of lamps and the flickering fire in the stove. We settled in front of the hearth, not bothering to do much else. The place had an oppressive stillness to it, like the world had forgotten this little corner of the forest. I don't know when it started, but there was something off about the house. It wasn't the creaks in the floorboards or the sound of something skittering around the roof. No, it was something deeper, a quiet hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I shook it off as the house settling, the wind, or maybe the odd acoustics of the place. Still, I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that kept creeping up on me. By midnight, we were both sitting on the worn-out couch, flicking through a magazine I'd found on the coffee table. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the silence outside was absolute. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, like a knock. Soft, deliberate, almost like someone was tapping gently on the side of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to Luke, who was looking at me, a confused expression on his face. He hadn't heard it, or at least he didn't seem to think it was anything out of the ordinary. "Maybe it's just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. Animals didn't knock, and this didn't sound like the random scrapes and scratches you get when raccoons or squirrels get curious. The next few minutes were tense. I kept listening, straining for another sound, but nothing came. I exhaled and rubbed my face, trying to calm my nerves. That's when the noise came again, but this time it was louder. It wasn't a tap, but more like a thud, solid, deliberate. I stood up, instinctively walking toward the window, but I didn't dare open it. I didn't want to know what was outside. Luke followed me over to the window, and we both stared out into the pitch-black night. The trees were still, and I couldn't see anything out of place. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves in the distance. No movement. I turned back, trying to shake off the feeling gnawing at my stomach. Maybe it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something bigger. The more I thought about it, the more my mind spun in circles, looking for rational explanations for the irrational. We decided to call it a night, though I could hardly sleep. Every creak of the house seemed amplified in the dark. The old wood groaned and shifted, and every gust of wind outside made the cabin sound like it was going to collapse. I pulled the blankets tightly around me and tried to push the thoughts from my mind, but they kept coming back. The sound, the knocking, the heavy silence that followed. It must have been hours before I finally dozed off, but I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of the door creaking open. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The door wasn't locked. I'd never even thought to check it. In that moment, it felt like the most idiotic thing I'd ever done. I slowly sat up in bed, my eyes scanning the dark room. Luke was still asleep on the other side of the room. I could hear his steady breathing, but beyond that, there was nothing. I strained my ears, listening for any movement. Nothing. I got up, grabbed a flashlight from the table, and carefully stepped toward the door. It was slightly ajar, swaying ever so slightly as if someone had just been there and left. My hands trembled as I closed the door and bolted it shut. I knew I was probably overreacting, but something didn't sit right. I checked the windows, the back door, everything, but I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. The morning light came too slowly, and when it did, I felt exhausted. I didn't want to leave, but neither of us had any intention of staying another night. There was no telling what we'd stumbled into, but the tension, the sense of unease, was more than enough to make me want to get out of there. We packed up quickly, not saying much. As we drove away, I looked back one last time at the cabin. The trees were just as dense, the land just as wild, but something about it felt abandoned for a reason. There was no comfort in that place, no sense of welcome. It wasn't the cabin itself that was the problem, but the feeling it gave off. The way it seemed to draw you in, only to remind you that there's no such thing as safety in the wild. As we drove further away, the unease didn't leave me. I kept thinking about the door, the knocking, the way the silence had felt. It all pointed to one thing. The woods had swallowed this cabin up, and it didn't want anyone to find it again. The rain was relentless. It had been falling steadily for hours. The sound of it hitting the metal roof of the cabin was the only thing I could focus on. The wind howled through the trees, causing the branches to scrape against the windows, and every so often, I could hear a tree limb cracking, threatening to come crashing down. The cabin wasn't much, just a small structure in the middle of a secluded forest in the mountains of Montana, but it was mine, at least for now. I'd been out here for a few days already, far from any sign of civilization, trying to clear my head. It wasn't something I'd usually do, but after the past few months, losing my job, then my partner moving on, I needed this. The fresh air, the quiet. The only thing keeping me company was my dog, a grizzled mutt named Max, who seemed to enjoy the solitude more than I did. The cabin, though, hadn't been built with comfort in mind. It was functional, a small structure made with rough-hewn logs, a single room with a tiny kitchen in one corner, a wood stove in the other, and a small loft where I slept. The walls were bare, except for a few shelves filled with basic supplies and tools. A simple cot and a few blankets were all I had in terms of furnishings. The floor was unfinished wood, rough beneath my feet, but I was too exhausted to care. I'd spent the previous days working on a small project, building a small shed to store some of the firewood. I'd been trying to keep myself busy, to feel like I was accomplishing something, even if it was just stacking wood in a small building. But the rain had stopped me. I couldn't get much done when everything was soaked, and every time I went outside, the ground would pull at my boots, and the wind would sting my face. It was enough to make me retreat inside, where I had started a fire earlier that day. Max was curled up on the small rug by the stove, eyes half-lidded, clearly content. I had been working on a pot of stew, one of the few meals I could cook with the limited supplies I'd brought, and the smell of it mixed with the heavy scent of the wet wood and earth outside. It was oddly comforting, even though the storm outside was far from it. As I stirred the stew, I thought back to how I'd ended up in this situation. The decision to leave everything behind had been a last-ditch effort to clear my head. I had always been drawn to the outdoors, and the idea of living in a small, isolated cabin had seemed perfect. The escape was supposed to give me peace, let me come to terms with everything that had happened, but now I was starting to feel the weight of it all. The isolation, the silence, the pressure to keep busy so I didn't go crazy with the thoughts that kept surfacing. The rain seemed to intensify, and I could hear the wind pick up again. The fire crackled, and the heat from the stove made the cabin feel like a refuge from the storm. I checked the clock. It was getting late, and I still hadn't finished the stew. It was the kind of night that would make anyone want to stay inside, wrapped in blankets and away from the rain. Max lifted his head, ears twitching. I glanced at him, but he didn't bark. He was quiet, just watching the window. I figured it was probably just the storm, but then I noticed something. A soft thud against the door. Not thunder. It was too precise, too heavy for that. I froze, my hand stilling on the pot as my mind raced. Max's tail started to twitch, and his low growl filled the silence. The wind outside had picked up, but this sound, it had been different. Another thud came from the door. This one was louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I glanced around the cabin. There was no way anyone should be out there. The closest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived.
No hikers, no hunters.
Nothing, just the rain and the wilderness. Max stood up, his growl deepening into something more threatening. I slowly set the spoon down on the counter and moved toward the door, trying not to make any noise. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't want to make myself known just yet. If there was someone out there, I wasn't sure what they wanted or if they meant any harm. The thud came again. This time, it sounded like it was on the other side of the door, like someone was pushing against it. I crept to the small window by the door and peeked out, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see anything, just the blur of the rain and the shadows of the trees beyond. It was hard to tell with the storm, but there was something off about the way the rain was falling, almost like it was being disturbed by something moving. I pulled back from the window, sweat trickling down the back of my neck. Max was still growling softly, his body tense. Another thud. This one was more forceful. It rattled the door, and I instinctively grabbed the axe that was propped up against the wall by the fireplace. I had no idea who or what was outside, but I wasn't about to be caught off guard. I stayed by the door, holding my breath, listening for any sign of movement. The storm outside had grown to a fever pitch, and the wind was howling so loudly that it was hard to distinguish any other sounds. The thudding stopped, and a new sound replaced it. A scraping, like metal against wood, followed by a soft shuffle. I strained to hear over the storm, but it was there, unmistakable. Then it stopped. The silence stretched on. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. My mind raced. Was it a person? An animal? Maybe a bear? Or someone who had gotten lost in the storm? But the way they were moving, it didn't feel right. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing came. The sound didn't resume. The rain kept pouring, and Max eventually settled back down, though his eyes were wide, scanning the room. I made my way back to the stove, still tense, but the storm outside had finally started to die down. I felt the strange urge to check the door one more time. Maybe it was just a branch hitting it or a wild animal knocking against the wood. I opened the door cautiously. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything, but the wood on the threshold. It had been scratched deeply, like something had tried to pry its way inside. The realization hit me then. The danger wasn't over. But for now, I was safe. The door had held. The storm had passed. And the night? It seemed quieter now, almost deceptively so. Max and I stayed inside the cabin, the fire crackling softly as I finished my stew. The silence was louder than ever. I kept my guard up, eyes always scanning the windows, ears always straining for the next sound. But nothing came. I'd been wanting some time away from everything. The noise, the people, the constant rush. I needed peace, so I booked a small cabin in the countryside. A place called Cedar Ridge, about a 3-hour drive from the city. I'd been feeling worn out for weeks, the stress from work creeping in every night, leaving me restless. The thought of nature, isolation, and just the simple quiet of it all sounded like the perfect way to recharge. I arrived there on a late afternoon in early October. The sun was still hanging low, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape, and the air had that crisp bite to it, hinting at the coming of fall. As I pulled up to the cabin, nestled away on the edge of a thick forest, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The small dirt road I'd taken to get there was empty, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind breaking the silence. It was everything I hoped for. The cabin itself was simple but charming. It was made of dark wood, with a stone chimney and small windows that let in the last of the daylight. It had a wraparound porch, complete with a swing. There was a small gravel path leading to the back, where a tiny stream trickled through, the sound of it barely audible over the chirping birds and rustling trees. The owner, an older man named Frank, greeted me at the door. He looked a bit weathered, his hair and beard graying with age, and his clothes were a bit worn, but he had a kind face. He didn't say much, just handed me the keys and told me to enjoy my stay. Before I could thank him, he was gone, his truck rumbling down the path and disappearing into the distance. I spent the rest of the evening getting comfortable, unpacking my things and setting up a little fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth from the fire spread through the room, making the place feel cozy. I made myself some tea and sat by the window, watching the darkening sky and listening to the sounds of the night creeping in. The forest felt alive, branches cracking under the weight of unseen creatures, leaves rustling in the wind. It was peaceful, yet there was a weight to it, a kind of stillness that made my skin prickle with unease. But I brushed it off, chalking it up to being in a new place. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the door. At first, I thought it might be a small animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the scratching was too deliberate, too persistent. It made my heart race, and for a moment, I just lay there in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening intently. The air in the room felt heavier now, and I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. I got out of bed quietly, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I moved towards the door, my hand on the handle, and listened. The scratching had stopped. For a brief second, I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then I heard a soft thud, like something heavy had dropped to the ground right outside. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away slowly, my heart pounding harder now. The last thing I wanted to do was get caught out there in the dark with whatever it was. I looked around the room for something to defend myself with, but all I had was a small lamp and a few candles. I grabbed one of the thick candles and set it on the table, holding it tight in my hand like it might protect me from whatever was out there. Minutes passed, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. The silence was now more unsettling than before. I sat in the chair by the fireplace, watching the orange embers crackle and flicker, trying to focus on anything other than the sounds coming from outside. A part of me wanted to just leave, pack up, and drive back home, but I didn't want to be the person who ran away from a little scare. I kept telling myself that it was just a wild animal. But even with that reassurance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the soft thud followed by the scratching. This time it was louder, closer. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag and moved toward the window. I peered through the blinds, squinting into the darkness. My breath caught in my throat when I saw someone, standing near the edge of the woods. It was a man, or at least what appeared to be a man, though I couldn't make out any details. He stood still, not moving, just staring into the cabin. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. The logical part of me screamed to call the authorities, but I knew the nearest town was miles away, and the phone service here was spotty at best. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it was probably just a local who lived nearby. But the longer I stared, the more something felt off. His stance, the way he was positioned just outside of the light from the cabin, seemed almost deliberate, like he was waiting for something, or maybe someone. The longer I watched, the more certain I became that he wasn't just a random person passing through. Suddenly, he moved, but not toward the door, like I'd expected. Instead, he walked around the side of the cabin, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't know what to do. The thought of him lingering around the cabin was terrifying, but I was paralyzed. I stayed by the window, watching, waiting for any sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, I saw him again. This time he was closer, standing just outside the porch, almost as if he was waiting for me to open the door. I wasn't going to make that mistake. I bolted the door, turned off the lights, and hid in the far corner of the cabin. I don't know how long I stayed like that, too scared to even move. It was only when the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon that I dared to breathe again. The man was gone. I didn't hear the scratching anymore, and the stillness returned. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things, deciding it was best to leave. I didn't even bother to check out. I just left the keys on the counter and locked the door behind me. The drive back felt longer than it should have, the unease never fully leaving me. I never did find out who that man was or why he was there, but I don't think I need to. All I know is that whatever it was something I wasn't prepared for. And whatever peace I thought I'd find in that cabin in the woods, I realized I didn't want it at the cost of my safety. By the time I reached the main road and saw the signs of civilization again, I could finally breathe easy. I didn't feel the weight of the forest anymore, nor did I feel the oppressive quiet. But that feeling, the one where you know something isn't right, where your instincts scream at you to leave, stayed with me long after the cabin was out of sight. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. After a long stretch of work, I decided to get away from everything for a few days. I wasn't one for big crowds, so a quiet cabin out in the middle of nowhere seemed perfect. The kind of place where you could hear your own thoughts and maybe the occasional squirrel scampering across the porch. The cabin I rented was tucked away in the northern part of Idaho, about 2 hours from the nearest town. It was a small, old thing, maybe 50 or 60 years old. The wood was weathered, with spots where the paint had peeled off, revealing the gray boards beneath. I didn't mind it. In fact, I kind of liked the rustic look. The fact that the cabin was in the middle of dense woods was even better. There were no neighbors for miles, just miles and miles of trees. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The air was crisp, with a chill that made me feel alive in a way the city never could. As I unloaded my stuff from the car, the silence was almost overwhelming. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional rustling of branches overhead. The inside of the cabin was cozy enough. It had a small living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, and a couple of small bedrooms. I unpacked my bag, set up my things, and made myself comfortable by the fire. As night started to fall, I made myself dinner, a simple meal of canned chili and some crackers. I sat by the fire, eating in the quiet and letting my mind wander. There was something soothing about the solitude. It felt like a rare luxury. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere started to change. The wind picked up, howling through the trees outside, making the cabin creak. The air felt colder, and I found myself checking the fireplace to make sure the flames hadn't died down. I had to remind myself that I was alone here. Nothing was going to happen. But then I heard it, a sound in the distance. A knock. It was soft at first, but then it came again, louder, more insistent. My heart rate spiked and I froze. I sat there, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind, branches tapping against the windows or maybe the house settling. I waited, straining my ears, but the knock didn't come again. For a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. The isolation was playing tricks on me. I grabbed a blanket and settled into the couch with a book. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't a knock. It was something dragging across the porch, slow and deliberate. The sound of something heavy scraping along the wood. My heart started pounding. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I didn't want to move. My mind raced with possibilities. Someone else had rented a cabin nearby and was just being stupid, or maybe someone was playing a prank. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was no one else around for miles. The closest cabin was over a mile away, and I hadn't seen another car on the road for hours. The scraping continued, And now there was the occasional rustling sound, like footsteps moving slowly across the porch. I sat there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. I thought about calling the local sheriff, but I didn't want to be the paranoid city person who panicked over nothing. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer next to me and crept toward the window. As I peered through the blinds, my stomach dropped. There, in the dim light of the porch, was a figure. A man, hunched over and dragging something across the floor. I couldn't make out his face, but his movements were slow, deliberate. I quickly pulled back from the window and pressed my back against the wall, trying to quiet my breathing. The flashlight felt heavy in my hands, like I was holding something far too large for my shaky grip. I debated what to do. Should I call the police? Should I hide and wait for him to leave? The first option seemed pointless. The nearest help was too far away. The second, hiding, seemed like the safer option, but I knew that if I didn't do something, I wouldn't feel safe again. I decided to wait, but the fear gnawed at me. Minutes passed like hours. The scraping continued for what seemed like forever. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I crept to the door and slowly unlatched the lock. I opened it just a crack, enough to peer through. The porch was empty now. The man was gone, but the marks of his dragging still lingered on the wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped outside. I walked carefully across the porch, my boots making soft, cautious thuds against the wood. As I reached the edge of the porch, I froze. The dragging marks led away from the door, into the woods. I didn't follow them, but a part of me felt compelled to. My legs trembled as I stood there, staring into the dark expanse of the forest. I had to get inside, had to lock the door, but something inside me still hesitated. I looked out at the dark trees, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against me. I retreated back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck. The only sound in the cabin now was the wind whistling outside, but it felt like there was something else. The cabin seemed off. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. I kept hearing noises, small things like the floor creaking or something tapping against the walls, but I couldn't bring myself to go back outside and look. My mind was playing tricks on me, or so I tried to convince myself. By morning, the scraping sound had stopped. The sun was rising, and the woods around the cabin looked peaceful again, bathed in a golden light. I stepped outside, half expecting to see something waiting for me, but there was nothing, just the fresh morning air and the quiet of the forest. I went back to the porch and looked down at the floor. There were no signs of dragging anymore. The marks had disappeared as if they had never been there. It felt like a dream, but the lingering sense of dread kept me on edge. I packed up my things that morning, loading the car with my gear. Before I left, I looked around one last time, half expecting someone to appear from the trees. But no one did. As I drove away, I glanced back one last time at the cabin, the woods beyond. The sun was shining brightly now, and everything seemed calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something. I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe a bad encounter, maybe just my mind getting the best of me. But I wasn't sticking around to find out. I didn't return to the cabin after that. In fact, I've never been able to shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me that night. The memory lingers in the back of my mind every time I drive through the woods, and I can't help but wonder if it was just a strange, isolated incident or something more sinister.